Hi everyone, my name's Stacy Penna. I'm the NVivo Community Director here at QSR. And before we get started, with our presentation, I'm just going to go over some of the housekeeping items when you use GoToWebinar. So you should be able to get to the menu. There's an orange box with a white arrow. If you click on that white arrow, it opens up the menu, and you'll see that there's a question area. So feel free to type in questions at any point. We're not going to take questions till the end, but happy for you to ask them as we go. Everyone's on mute, so it's just easier for you to hear everyone. And also, so if you have a question, if any issues with GoToWebinar, also just put that in the question area. So there is a handout. It's just in regards to the first couple slides we're showing and the slides at the end, because of the nature of the research that we'll be talking about, the presenters aren't able to share their PowerPoint slides with us in a handout, just so you know that. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and you'll get an email next week with the recording too, so you'll have access to that. So with that, I will get started. So the webinar is working with visual and sensory methods to research materiality, mobility, and rhythm. And I'll introduce our presenters in a second. First, again, I'm Stacy Penna, the NVivo Community Director, and I'll talk more about the community at the end, but I also wanted to introduce our partner with SAGE Publishing, Ali.
Hi everyone, I'm Ali Owen and I'm the commissioning editor for research methods books at SAGE. I'm based in London typically, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone today has to say. This is a really interesting set of topics and set of presenters, and I've only gotten to work with them kind of remotely through journal articles and peer review and some work on the SAGE Research Methods Foundation contributions. So looking forward to working with them more today.
Great, thanks, Ali. And I'm getting messages the handout isn't working, so don't worry, I will upload it again after the introductions. So very happy and excited for these presenters to learn more about their research. So we'll have our first presenter is Dr. Sweta Rajan-Rankin, and she's a senior lecturer in social work in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research at the University of Kent, and also the director of migration, ethnicity, race, and belonging in that research cluster. And then our second presenter today will be Dr. Sanders-McDonagh, and she's a senior lecturer in criminology in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research at University of Kent, and lead for the visual and sensory approaches for the research cluster. And that you see Dr. Rajan-Rankin and Dr. Lyon right there, and so then Dr. Dawn Lyon is our third presenter. She's a reader in sociology in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research, and co-director of research and innovation in the Division of Law, Society and Social Justice at the University of Kent. So welcome all three of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I'll do is I'm going make Dr. Rajan-Rankin our first presenter right now. So let me do that. Great, we can see your PowerPoint. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy and Ali. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Sweta Rajan-Rankin, and I'll be presenting my work on the social materialities of hair and using visual and sensory methods and looking at the importance of touch and textuality in relation to racialized belonging. Right, let's begin. So hair has been of enormous anthropological and sociological interest, but it is much more than just an object that lives on our bodies. It actually travels across the globe. From hair sacrificed in temples in India, it's taken in and formed into hair combs, treated and dyed in places like Indonesia, and converted into wigs and sold all across the world, including in places like black hair salons in Brixton, London. So why hair, and why must we look at hair and racialized belonging? Hair has a very important role in terms of self-presentation in the Black community. And while skin color and visual difference has always been associated with racialized difference, quite often we forget about texture-based difference and how hair plays a role in racialized encounters. When we look at the concept of Black aestheticism, we need to go beyond the notions of beauty norms as only being gendered, but also consider the intersections of race and gender in this regard. An anti-racist Black aestheticism generally invites us to recognize how racialized standards of beauty are internalized in such a way that we actually reproduce the workings of racism in relation to our daily lives. So by internalizing these notions that straight hair is beautiful and Anglo-Saxon beauty norms are in fact somehow privileged over Black beauty norms, it perpetuates these racialized beauty standards. And this is enacted in our everyday lives, whether we know it or not. And therefore, creating an emphasis on the social materiality of hair and decoupling it from representation allows us different ways to think about material intimacies, and I'll talk a bit more about this. I use a Deleuzian-Guattarian framework to explore social materiality of hair, but I do reject some of their claims in relation to flat assemblages. Using more material feminist approach, I look at hair as part of a broader assemblage of racialized belonging that includes both our bodies, but also how our bodies interact and intersect with the environments within which those bodies move. So using sort of Mary Douglas's concept of bodies out of place, I'm interested in how people of color experience racialized belonging in different spaces, such as hair salons, and of course in communities that are predominantly white or multi-ethnic and mixed. So using this notion of flows of affect, territorialization and deterritorialization, we're really looking at connections. It comes down to that. An assemblage is a set of connections. And we look at affect, which is the way in which we are affected by these connections in relation to racialized belonging. In several forthcoming papers, I propose a tentative framework for a racial assemblage, which is intersectional because it absolutely has to be seen in conjunction with gender, class, and sexuality. But looking at racial assemblage as an affective event that is quite agentic, it involves an interplay between the body politic, the individual, but also collective bodies. So we're looking at assemblages of bodies with other bodies, but also spaces and objects. And we're looking at this notion of how space, affect, and the body creates different types of temporal longings. And by this, I mean how an interaction in a hair salon can produce memories of racialized belonging in other places, such as one's own home country and so forth. This is pretty theory heavy, but the broad purpose of this notion of racial assemblage is that racism or racialization isn't just an event or a microaggression. It happens in specific spatial and geographic locations. And when we think about the intersections between bodies, objects, because hair can be seen as both object and body, and the spaces within which these bodies move, we get new and interesting insights into racialization. Right, moving on to the actual work I've done. So this work draws on a 2-year sensory ethnography, which took place in 2 different salons. Because I was interested in the notion of Black bodies in white spaces, I selected a hair salon in a very white community in the center of Kent in South England, and also another hair salon, an Afro hair salon in Brixton, which is quite a diverse and multi-ethnic area. When we talk about the Kentish salon and the work I did there, I used techniques of autoethnography and used my own body as a South Asian woman who basically, in a sense, I'm quite liminal. I'm neither white nor black. And therefore, I allowed my own body to be a research instrument and to watch how I was perceived and consumed in these spaces by the hairdressers, by other customers. And what is interesting from these photographs, you can see that the visual images in the salons significantly prioritized and privileged an Anglo-Saxon beauty norm of straight hair being good hair, and of course a privileging of color. So my natural hair is very curly, and every time I went to the salon, there was a real push from the hairdressers to straighten it, to undergo keratin straightening treatments, to color it. And unless they straightened and dealt with my hair in these particular ways, there was a certain sense of anxiety among the hairdressers who felt that, my hair's texture was something that needed to be contained, managed, and disciplined. This is not unusual, given in traditional European hair salons, a hair texture that is not smooth and silky is often seen as damaged or deficient. And I definitely, in that particular context, experienced myself as a body out of place. Now, the kinds of methods I used to collect data during this salon experience included visual images, as you see pictures of myself in after treatments, but also taking images of the salon space itself, some of their publicity material, and also the ways in which sound, for instance, creates a rhythm in the salon itself, a sense of a buzz and urgency, or the heat of hair dryers and so forth. So I made sound recordings, and of course I'm linking back to work that Dawn, for instance, has done on rhythm analysis. There's definitely a sense of affective intensity in these hair salons, which are of great interest. The second space where I did my research was in Electric Avenue in Brixton in London, and it's a really interesting space with a very rich history of racialized conflict, actually. And more recently, the space has become quite gentrified. So you see, it's a very vibrant place. It has huge superstores selling Afro hair products. You see, quite lovely graffiti on the walls. And what I did here in this space was I underwent braiding myself. So you can see some of the pictures down below where I was getting a weave put in, and also I got braided later on. And so much of the sensory data I collected involved not only observing and speaking to customers as they got their hair done, so they were undergoing a textual intervention while I interviewed them, but also going through these experiences myself to really get that embodied sense of what it means to have an Afro hair treatment. I spoke with wig sellers, I spoke with fruit sellers who worked in the market around Electric Avenue. And I think what was particularly interesting is how the hair salon actually becomes a speech community for affective belonging. The hairdressers would tell me that going to an Afro hair salon is like going to, for a day in the spa. A number of these treatments take 7-8 hours to do. And so it is a ritualized community experience, which is quite easygoing. There's no pressure or tension that I certainly experienced, or neither did the customers. But also the location of the salon in this changing neighborhood tells us quite a lot about cities. And I'm thinking about mobility here and Erin Sanders-McDonough's work on cities and gentrification, and how the salon is an important marker of these kinds of changes. So thinking theoretically about hair stories, I suggest they really should be looked at in terms of material assemblages which are structured by time. And they produce really interesting connections with memory as temporality. So we're thinking about material remembering and forgetting as a way of conceptualizing time through materiality. This is Hamilaki's work. And I definitely want to stress the work of touch and texture here involved in hair care, which produces intimacies between the hairdresser and the customer, but also memories of hair care between the customers themselves and their mothers and grandmothers, and how this produced racialized belonging for them. So coming to concluding comments, I do want to stress that the social materiality of hair actually produces an important theoretical and methodological tool where we see hair as an actant. It is a material and also materializing agential force through which racial identities are forged and undone. And therefore, this notion of affect, the fact that hair does something to us, it connects us up in some ways. It produces entanglements between bodies and other bodies, but also memories and connections and imperial intimacies. In fact, connections between, Black Caribbean diasporic communities here in England and those back home in the Caribbean. I do want to finally point out my last slide that social material analysis is so exciting for me because material data lives on. Following on from the project, I co-curated an art exhibition with colleagues in the School of Art, which was called Hair Textures of Belonging. And here are some of the really beautiful images you see from this hair exhibition, including the center image, which is by Sonia Boyce, a video installation which is called Entanglement. So you see two people, a white person, a black person, sort of having their hair braided together and thinking of entanglements in this regard. Or the image on the right, where a Japanese artist tries to think about mixed race identities and generational difference. So it's incredibly interesting and exciting to think about social materiality and visual methods in this way. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. That was very interesting. And for everyone who might have joined a little later, please feel free to type in questions at any point. There's in the GoToWebinar menu, there's a question area, or also in the chat. So our next presenter is Dr. Erin Sanders-McDonagh, Dana. Oh, sorry, and I'll make her presenter right now. Just a minute. Great, we can see your slides.
Perfect. Is that sharing? Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your slides.
Had some audio problems earlier, so just wanted to make sure that that I was. You won't be able to see me later because my camera's not cooperating, but at least my my microphone is. Thank you so much for that introduction, Stacey, and thanks, Sweta, for that presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about a project that I've done in collaboration with a colleague who's based at Brunel, Dr. Magali Pay-Rafit. It's a piece of research we've done looking at gentrification in London Soho. So thinking about the ways in which neon and colour are signifiers of gentrification. Just a quick note that all of the images in here are copyright of Magali. She's a photographer, an amazing photographer. So any photographs featured here, she's got the copyright for. So I'm aware that we've got an international audience and that many of you might not know where Soho is. So you can see here Soho sort of really in the central of London. We've got Buckingham Palace quite close by, the London Eye, Big Ben, Westminster Abbey, quite overpriced wax museum. And Soho is sort of bordered on the north to, this is Oxford Street here, so this is one of the biggest shopping streets in Europe. On the right is, on the west is Regent Street. Again, another shopping street with quite a long sort of emblematic of the history of London. To the south is Shaftesbury Avenue and Chinatown. So this is where we have the theatre district starting and a big Chinatown sort of on the border there. And to the east is Leicester Square. So Leicester Square is a sort of heart of the nighttime economy and a very touristic area. So the periphery of Soho is sort of bordered by lots of touristic kinds of spaces and places, but the center of Soho isn't often kind of accessed by tourists. And Soho has a really interesting history. In terms of its population, for centuries it's had different diasporic communities kind of migrating into it. So we've had Huguenots, Jewish populations from Russia and from Eastern Europe. We've had people from China, people from Italy. So people fleeing persecution or poverty. And Soho has been a really welcoming space for all of those communities. So it's a very kind of dynamic, very multicultural part of the city. It's also been a sort of home to the working class. So, you know, for a long time, it's sort of been down at heel, but very vibrant and very kind of convivial. It's also been the heart of LGBT life in London for decades. So Old Compton Street is really the kind of the center of LGBT life in London. It has been for a long time. At the height of the AIDS crisis, this is where a lot of people came together. This is where gay men really kind of were able to meet in a space that was socially acceptable for LGBT communities. In the 1960s, Paul Raymond, a sort of entrepreneur, who some of you might have heard of, bought a lot of property in Soho because it was really inexpensive at the time. And he was a sex entrepreneur. So he opened a lot of sex shops, sex theaters, different kinds of sexual venues. So Soho at that time was sort of was laden with these kind of sexual entertainment venues. But alongside of that, you also had a booming nighttime economy, LGBT kind of nighttime economy, alongside jazz music. Soho is really well known for jazz music and was very open to African American and Black musicians at a time where they weren't welcome in other parts of London. So Garland Wilson, quite a famous African American jazz musician, played at the opening of one of Soho's largest jazz venues in 1935. So we can see that this is far more progressive than even the sort of policies we had in Manhattan. So Soho has really welcomed a wide range of people, and it's always been a place where people who are a little bit different can come together and be together. Now, Paul Raymond bought so much of Soho that when he died in the mid-2000s, his granddaughters took over his estate, and that became Soho Estates. And they own over £1 billion worth of property in a 1 square mile area. So they own a huge amount of the property, and they work alongside Westminster City Council, which is the municipality which sort of governs this area. And together they've created a sort of a new way of thinking about Soho. So trying to get rid of some of what they call the sleaze and trying to sort of to make it a slightly more upmarket place. Now, Magali and I are really interested in this process of gentrification, and we're interested in a similar way to Sweta, to thinking about bodies out of place in Soho and how gentrification has impacted bodies out of place. So we've spent a lot of time in Soho, Magali and I, a lot of time in sex shops, a lot of time in any kind of sexual venue that you could imagine, a lot of time eating, drinking, smelling all kinds of things, because we really wanted to understand the changes that were happening in Soho. And because it's such a dynamic space, it didn't feel right just to do interviews or to try and do surveys or even just use visual methods, because the sounds, the smells, the touch and the feel of places, and also the affective dimensions were really important in understanding this particular part of London. So we decided to walk and to map. And we decided to sort of walk through Soho at various points. So thinking about Soho at night, Soho at daytime, how the rhythms of the city made Soho feel and look different. And as we walked and mapped, we sort of came up with our own particular methodology, which we call Fragment Methodology. And this is focused particularly on understanding the sensorial in a sort of, the sensory elements are often fragmented, but when we put them together in a sort of collage effect, it allows us to get a holistic understanding of the city. So we draw on work from Mason and Denson, what they call sort of faceting, but because we're specifically interested in the sensorial fragments, it's sort of diversion or a move away from their original ideas. So we're interested in how sight, sound, smells, touch, texture all work together, but are sort of separate entities, and sort of thinking about how these fragments make the city, make this part of Soho. I'll go through this quite quickly, but I think it's important that our research is really embodied, really draws on the phenomenological, and is quite effective. So the multisensory approaches that we use are very experiential, and we draw on sort of scholars like Merleau-Ponty, phenomenologists who stress the importance of recognizing and experience the world through our body. So not just what we see or what we hear, but what we smell, taste, touch, and feel. Similarly, Lefebvre, in his work on cities, reminds us that urban spaces demand that we take a multisensory approach. And this is something that Dawn will talk about in her presentation as well, but the rhythms of the city are connected to the sensorial in ways that we can't disentangle. And Hurdley and Dick write, I think, quite persuasively about sensory approaches, and they say that they offer empathetic and experiential ways of understanding the social world. And the sensory turn in social sciences centers the sensuous, embodied person as the place for intimate, affective forms of knowing. So affect comes out of this research, I think, very clearly. So I'll move on to one of the sensory forms of data that we collected, which is really thinking about neon and the use of neon and lighting and color. So things that we as social scientists might not notice or might not pay attention to, but actually as we walked and mapped became incredibly important for understanding the changes that were happening. So as we walked and mapped over this 3-year period, what we started to notice was that there were a number of venues that were closing, and venues that were quite important to different communities. So we saw sex shops closing and LGBT venues closing. We saw the closure of certain nighttime venues that attracted the wrong kind of crowd. So Soho Estates and Westminster City Council really want a kind of middle class, very genteel, very kind of wealthy, sort of mix of tourists and people moving through this space. Madame Jojo's, which you can see in this image on the left, has a long history in Soho. It's a burlesque bar. They do trans and drag. It's been really welcoming for the LGBT community, and it was closed on really spurious grounds. And now it's been turned into something completely different. So Soho Estates was able, along with Westminster City Council, to kind of take the building over because of the spurious reason that it was closed. And now it's become a very kind of gentrified, well-heeled burlesque for the middle class, rather than a sort of democratized venue for people, you know, of all classes and all kinds of backgrounds. So really appealing to a middle class market. We've seen the unethical and often illegal eviction of sex workers. Sex workers have a long history in Soho. The sex work community, if you look at organizations like the English Collective of Prostitutes that are an advocacy group for sex workers, they're really upset about the closures in Soho and about the evictions because sex workers have a community in Soho. They know each other, they know people who live in the community, they're welcomed by the community, and their evictions are often done in incredibly offensive ways. So sex workers have been dragged into the street in their bras and underwear, with the press invited to take pictures and images splashed on their front page. Often these evictions are illegal, but they continue to do it because they really don't want Soho to be associated with the sex industry in any way. We've also seen the closure of local markets and shops and cafes, so cheap places where you can buy food. If you're in social housing, or if you're just a normal everyday person, being able to go to a fruit and veg market, being able to go to a local shop, being able to get breakfast for less than £20. You know, those places just don't exist in Soho anymore. And really troubling is the use of anti-homelessness architecture. So spikes and railings and kind of the use of benches that don't allow people to lie down. And the closure of public toilets, which is not something perhaps that we think is important, but actually for homeless populations, particularly in an urban city center, the use of public toilets is incredibly important. And they've closed them specifically to get rid of homeless populations in the area. So this clearing out of kind of undesirables in order to make it a more kind of middle class or upper class space. And if we think about what's taken the place of these venues, so we can see here these colors, they're bright, they're cheerful, there's lots of neon. These are 2 sex shops that have been open in Soho for decades. This is the Raymond Review sign. So Raymond Review was Paul Raymond's sort of original strip club. So this is a neon sign that's incredibly important and very well known. This is what's replaced it. So you can see the opening of high-end private members clubs, taking over sort of venues that have this kind of this bright or spectacular kind of coloring. and to replace it with images or with spaces like this. So the Whole Foods Market has opened. Now this is near Piccadilly Circus, and this venue used to be an Irish bar and restaurant. It was actually one of the first places that I worked when I came to London. It wasn't an expensive pub, it was open quite late. It was for people who were coming over, sort of the Irish diaspora, coming over to visit friends or family. There was live music. You know, it had a very different feel. And now you can see that sort of the terrain, it's been pedestrianized, which is something we normally associate in sort of positive ways, but actually here it's been pedestrianized to create a particular aesthetic and almost a sanitized aesthetic. So you can see there's lots of whites, lots of neutrals. The image at the bottom, this is Smith's Close. So again, this is owned by Soho Estates. For those of you that are familiar with middle class paint, these are all painted in Faro and Ball colors. The reason that the shops are empty, they've been empty for years, is because Soho Estates would rather them sit empty until they can find the right elite upper class kind of entrepreneur to take them over, and not just have somebody in there who's not going to bring the right kind of feel. So they'd rather them sit empty and make no money than to have somebody in it who's not right for the area. And this kind of lighting here, this is a new hotel that opened, and you can see it's very, you know, it's very aesthetically pleasing, it's very neutral. And these neutralized color schemes and the pedestrianization, you can see this in different parts of Soho, where Soho Estates are really trying to kind of take over and take control. Another interesting sort of phenomenon that Magali and I noticed as we were going through was a sort of appropriation of neon by venues that weren't part of the sex industry. So obviously with the history of the sex industry, neon was a huge part of Soho for a very long time, and neon lighting is incredibly expensive. So often the neon lights were rented to shops, and there's sort of a neon graveyard in East London that kind of, it's taken a lot of the neon from Soho, and you can go and visit the sort of neon graveyard if you want to. But a lot of the shops that have opened have taken over the original neon from Soho and used it for their own I guess for their own gain. So here we can see a very high-end hairdresser. So if you've got £200 or $150 to get a haircut, this is the kind of place that you might go. And they've got the sort of neon, this original neon from original Soho that says "come in again." So they've kind of taken this sort of this signifier of the kind of the sex industry, and they've reappropriated it. And it's a nod, or a sort of nod to the original Soho, but they took this space of a shop that served the local community. And most local people, unless you're, you know, very rich, or unless you work in the area and have lots of money, you're not paying £200 for a haircut. This is a quote unquote anarchist pub. So we've got beer porn in neon here, and the sort of the caging that goes along with it. So, you know, we can see the sort of anarchist pub really kind of appropriating this idea of beer porn, recognizing that Soho has this kind of edgy, seedy side of it, but really welcoming a white middle class kind of population. Anarchist beer is surprisingly expensive. The last image at the top, which it took Magali and I quite a long time to figure out what this place was, because this is the only signage at the front. And, you know, for about 6 months, we just assumed it was a lap dancing club or an adult video store or a peep show. And then after kind of building up the courage to go in on a Friday night and asking if we could go downstairs and have a look at what was happening, we realized that it was a Mexican tapas bar. So again, you know, after getting your £200 haircut at the salon and getting some overpriced beer at the anarchist pub, you can go and have £20 margaritas or some really terrible burritos at this place. So you can see the appropriation of neon by these kind of very middle-class gentrifying stores is done in a very particular way to kind of to nod to the edginess of Soho, while at the same time replacing the authentic edgy venues that were there before. And so in conclusion, you know, one of the things that really became clear to us is that something as simple as looking at lighting and color schemes can tell us a huge amount about something like gentrification. And mapping these changes over time allowed us to build a picture of the changes that were happening. So we built like categorizations and typologies of neon and color to see what shops are coming in, what kind of shops they're replacing, where we see kind of original neon and where we see the appropriation of neon and what that says. And we use this alongside a number of other sort of its methods. So we look at documentation, licensing applications, applications for change of use, so official documentations that are publicly available to try and understand where Westminster City Council and Soho Estates are kind of working together, thinking about who owns what and who's appropriating what kind of lighting or color schemes to indicate their sort of their edginess or their class location. But it tells us a lot about who's welcome in these spaces and who's being excluded. So, you know, things like sexuality, gender, class, and race are all really imbued in these changes. So something as simple as looking at lighting can tell us something about these much bigger sociological issues, which I think is really important in terms of understanding the value of the multisensory. And this goes alongside other things that we've done. So mapping smells, thinking about the changing smell in terms of food or drink, the smell of urine and vomit, which is not particularly pleasant, but actually is really interesting in thinking about the rhythms of the city and what places are connected to the nighttime economy. We think about textures and the feel of pavements and architecture. We often map left objects or rubbish. And we track the rhythms of the city. So thinking about how Soho changes from day to afternoon to night and what these sensorial changes tell us. So for example, rubbish collection or trash collection in Soho happens, 3 or 4 times a day, which is quite interesting. But the idea is that, Westminster City Council wants to keep it clean. And so the sanitization, sort of recognizing how often the city is cleaned, how it's cleaned, tells us quite a lot about the changes that are happening in Soho. And of course, we've also done mobile interviews with residents, local stakeholders, normal sort of, standard sociological or social science, using social science methods, which are important to add to this, I think. But really what I want to highlight is simply by looking at neon and color in Soho, we've been able to document and change processes of gentrification. So it allows us to move beyond these traditional methods to really understanding and building something that's unique, and that just by really thinking about the sort of the textures and the colors, we can understand a lot about the sort of the process of hegemonic gentrification in this space. So I'll leave it there. And just some further references. Magali and I have a book coming in 2021 on this from UCL Press, and a number of other publications that sort of relate to neon or sex shops and this process of hegemonic gentrification. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Erin. That was really fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. And our third presenter is Dr. Dawn Lyon, and I'll make her presenter now. Excellent. We can see your PowerPoint.
That's great. Thank you very much. And thanks for such a nice invitation and the opportunity to be part of this webinar series. And thank you too to my colleagues, Erin and Sweta there, for really showing us how we can work with the sensory and just such lovely attention to colour and texture, and making it easy for me by foregrounding issues of materiality and rhythm. So I'm going to take you on a kind of methodological journey and to share the interconnected ways in which I made use of my body, senses, and audio and visual recordings to explore and animate the temporal and spatial unfolding of a particular place. In this case, a fish market, one of my favourite kinds of places, but through a practice that I hope will be of interest to people working in different fields. Okay. So my research site is London's Billingsgate Fish Market, which is the UK's largest inland market, and it's been in East London since the early 1980s, but in the City of London for several hundred years, in fact. And it's a predominantly wholesale market selling fish and seafood, mostly, as I say, most predominantly wholesale, but also open to the public some of the time. So it's a very kind of rich and varied place. But across the 3 papers that you're hearing today, actually, we get quite a nice story of different parts of London. And we've moved from southwest London in Brixton through to West London, and now we're looking at the east. So there's also some really lovely spatial connections there. Before the market gets going at midnight or 1 AM, the market hall itself is more or less empty and still. It's a far cry from the mood that will later take hold. So what moves it, I wondered? How does it take shape and become the lively site of work and distribution that it's widely known for? And really, how do the senses, as Erin said, how do the senses make the city? How do the senses make the market in the city? And I came to this with interest in the sociology of work and trying to understand how work happens at the market, but got very taken with the significance of rhythm and its unfolding. So when I first spent time in the market, I felt the non-belonging in my body. My movements were staccato. I literally didn't know where to place myself. But I mostly started to sense the rhythms of the market through being out of sync and out of step, a sense of arrhythmia, if you like, lacking the spatial confidence, as Louise Nash puts it, of the insider. But it's really important sometimes when we're doing this kind of research that we stay with what doesn't work, or certainly that doesn't make us feel comfortable. And this disjuncture was instructive. As Henri Lefebvre and Catherine Regulier, his collaborator, argue, we become aware of our rhythms when we suffer from some irregularity or disorderliness. So disruption reveals rhythm and offers a heuristic device for doing research into rhythm. I'll come back to them in a moment. So researching this world meant I had to calibrate my body to the market's rhythms. Not only did I have to get up very early in the morning, but when I was there, I would do that in quite a literal way. So I took the opportunity and took some time to absorb the rhythms of market life and become aware in so doing of the fluidity of the ways in which other figures in the market, the porter we see here, knew how to move around the market and bend to its activity. This is what Lefebvre calls dressage, a process of bodily entrainment and repetition through which rhythm is incorporated. Now, I say I did this in some very deliberate ways. So I would match my stride to the porters I shadowed, literally as they rushed orders from a chill store to a waiting van. I would scamper behind them and register rhythm at a kinesthetic level in relation to my usual pattern and pace. So it was using my own body as a kind of reference or metronome, as Lefebvre describes, to notice the speed and movement of others. So this was a case of really thinking with the body and all the senses, not in the abstract, but in lived temporality, as he writes. And in addition, the focus on singular rhythms. So at one point, the rhythms of the porters, at another, the buyers, or the fitch merchants themselves. This was really helpful to disentangle elements of the polyrhythmic assemblage of Billingsgate, and they're echoing some of the ideas that Sweta shared about the entanglements of materiality in time and space. So what then is this rhythm analysis that I've already alluded to? Well, in fact, I found that I was doing what the French philosopher and urban scholar and Henri Lefebvre and collaborator Catherine Regulier called rhythm analysis. It's both an immersive phenomenological practice and a means to critique everyday life and the linear rhythms that increasingly invade routine practices in advanced capitalist economies and structure our everyday experience. And Erin's already alluded to Lefebvre's work on the city, which is part of his critique of the way that urban life is taking shape, and linear rhythm as a structuring principle in that. And I think we've seen how rhythm is so integral to the making of our everyday worlds in the pandemic like at no other time. Certainly in my in the last few years that I've been working on rhythm analysis, it's come to the fore in terms of people recognizing and saying, oh yes, I get what you were trying to do there. So the ideas of rhythm analysis are first captured in several essays and then brought together in this volume called Rhythm Analysis, translated and published in English in 2004, but previously in French just a year after Lefebvre died in 1992. And then I wrote a book called What is Rhythm Analysis, if you're interested in exploring this further, that came out in 2018 and has just been relaunched. It's actually the same book, but relaunched under the title Rhythm Analysis Research Methods. So in rhythm analysis, rhythm is actually an object and a tool of analysis to show how change occurs through the imprinting of new rhythms at different scales. And Lefebvre talks about this at the scale of an era, but it can also be, as Erin's just been talking, at the scale of the gentrification of an area of the city. But its intangibility makes it difficult to research and requires some experimental or inventive practices. Now, the body is central. It's clear in Lefebvre, the body is central. To grasp a rhythm, it's necessary to have been grasped by it, he writes. One must let oneself go, give oneself over, abandon oneself to its duration. But is this enough? And that's where the next stage of our story takes us. So having experienced that sense of bodily engagement with the rhythms of the market, I tried a different tack. I sought to document the rhythms using photography, and I'd worked with photography as an effective means of capturing the craft work of fishmongers, gutting, cleaning, skinning, and the materiality of the fish in a retail setting. But the work at Billingsgate doesn't involve that kind of hands-on, tactile gutting and filleting. The fish are sold whole or pre-filleted. So the images here allude to the labour of display, as each stand presents samples of fish. They're aestheticised and staged in the sphere of exchange, as Bohm puts it. But whilst I could see this process happening in real time, I felt that my images didn't capture the sensory richness of the scene over time. And eventually I stopped taking pictures because I just kept repeating myself and taking the same ones. I played around with juxtaposition and collage to try to retain something of the vitality of the scene, but I didn't really find them effective to sense rhythm. So then I tried a different approach, and what Lefebvre refers to as the attentive ear became a more important tool and also a counter to the dominance of the visual in accounts of urban and everyday experience. So I'd walk into the market hall and notice a crescendo of sound marked by different layers. Might be the close ring of a telephone, someone shouting, or the squeak of polystyrene boxes that you can see here. Lefebvre instructs the rhythm analyst to listen to the world, to listen to noises, to listen to murmurs, and finally to listen to silences. So I did what Hall and colleagues call sound walking, collecting short recordings of the market to attend to and disentangle the way that it unfolds. But still I wasn't quite satisfied. Despite the gains of moving around the space and deploying these different senses as research tactics, I asked myself, what if immersion and close attention are actually obstacles to the perception of the ebb and flow of the market? How can we deal with the sense of sensory excess there and catch more of the polyrhythmic complexity? And here I extended sensation, if you like, by using audio-visual techniques to record rhythm and reveal what our senses cannot directly perceive. Now, I'd felt my failure to grasp the market as a kind of bodily expression. So I'd repeatedly look over my shoulder as I was wandering around, uncertain of where the market was happening. And I felt that I'd been there, a sort of sense accumulated through time, but I didn't feel present there in time and space. Now, Lefebvre writes, in order to grasp and analyse rhythms, it's necessary to get outside of them, but not completely. And he recommended the marvellous invention, as he called it, of a balcony, or failing that, a window, from where the flow of sounds and movements can be disentangled. And he used this technique himself in his famous Scene from the Window chapter from his apartment in Paris. So at Billingsgate, I repeatedly found myself climbing the stairs and looking down on the market hall from a first floor gallery as a way to try to contain and clarify what was actually going on without being overloaded in a sensory way. And it's here that this possibility of making a film to capture the rhythm of the market really began to emerge. So with a collaborator, Kevin Reynolds, we used time-lapse photography to record one night in the life of the market, from setup to close, from 1 o'clock in the morning to midday. And the images you can see here are just 3 pictures at different times. You might just be able to make out the times as there's a clock at the top of the center of each of the images. We set up in this gallery location and took a photograph every 10 seconds to record, as Paul Thompson puts it, the qualitative unfolding of events as they happen in linear clock time, and reveal how various cyclical and linear rhythms and routines interfere and interrelate. And we put together a film or an audio-visual montage that combined my sound walking extracts, so these audio recordings, with the sequences of images speeded up so 1 hour is presented in 30 seconds. I'm afraid it's a bit too much for the technological context to show you the video at the same time as streaming this, but the link there, the YouTube link, is available for you to have a look. In a way, making this film was itself a creative analytic process, which evokes Billingsgate with an effective force that goes beyond representation. I'm using the work of Garrett and Hawkins there. So by losing some of the richness of the detail, we actually distinguish some threads, and the clock marks linear time, but also the film highlights not only the sequential process through which different types of work are interconnected and unfold, but also the cyclical unfolding of the life of the market with its multiple changing rhythms across the night that we can also sense in atmosphere. So the montage distinguishes threads amongst this tangle and shows the different loops of repetition, rupture and resumption. So there's always an interaction between our different types of rhythm. And sound connects viewers to the felt experiential aspects of moving through the market and its materiality. It's a contained world when trade is at its peak in its eurythmic flow. But once outside lights are switched off, once the inside lights are switched off and daylight is seen reflected on the wet floor, the viewer recognises the rhythms of the market as being at odds with the city space around it, an instance of arrhythmia. So just to conclude, I've talked about different ways of getting into rhythm and the journey between them as a multifaceted, multisensory embodied practice that uses the body, specific senses, the eye and the ear, and extends it to the camera and the audio recorder. We've seen how time-lapse is a means of seeing things that are not visible in the real world. And really one thing I want to emphasize is how working in this way with the senses and other means by which the senses are, or other means by which we can sense the market, is a way of creating new and different types of knowledge, and to develop also a novel way of doing rhythm analysis, which itself contributes to the promotion of spatially, temporally and sensually attuned practices of research for the study of everyday life. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Another excellent presentation. These all 3 have been very enlightening. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen again, and then we'll go through a few questions. Just want to go through a few things. In the handout, just talks about some of the different products NVivo has, but I wanted to bring up that we have more webinars in the series. The next one is on March 4th about creative ways to visualize qualitative data. So please, these are all complimentary, and it's a great way to learn from fellow researchers. And also another way to help researchers share their research. I have an NVivo podcast, Between the Data. Feel free to search it on any of the podcast platforms. And lastly, we'd love to have people join the community so you can share and learn from each other, connect with researchers, and we also have funding opportunities. So there's a short survey at the end of this, if you don't mind taking it, that will ask if you'd like to be part of the community, and I can send you information for that. But now I want to get to the questions. So I'm going to give each presenter, just because of time, one question. So let me just go find the first one for Sweta. Nadine is asking, that was an amazing presentation. I would like to know about how you approach the concepts of territorialization and a deterritorialization when looking at the socio-material aspect of hair within a racial assemblage.
Hi, thank you so much for that great question. As with all forms of ethnographic research, many of the theoretical concepts provide ways in which we can understand what's unfolding. But what I found particularly interesting was ingress and egress, if you like, entry and exit from the salon, and how customers were engaged with, especially at the entry level into the salon where they were directed. An example I can give you here is as an Asian researcher, when I entered the Afro hair salon, they engaged in ethnic matching. So I was immediately matched up with the Turkish beautician who did not do hair, but they were completely convinced that I would be much more comfortable with an Asian or Middle Eastern stylist rather than the Caribbean stylist. So here you see territorialization as a way of cementing racial and ethnic identification and bonds together. So it wasn't so much the hair practice that I wanted to engage in, it was a particular way in which my body was read. Deterritorialization here for me involves stepping away or branching away from the dominant norms. So in the Kentish salon, I resisted some straightening treatments and I observed how the hairdressers responded to me, quite often with disappointment and disapproval. And so these are just ways in which we play with the notions of flows of affect. You know, what allows racial belonging to happen, what allows exclusion to happen, and what happens with bodies and objects in that context. Thanks so much for the question.
Oh, thank you very much. And Ali, I'm not sure if you received the question. I shared some questions with you if you wanted to ask some. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I did. And so these are for Erin. We might be able to combine them because they're somewhat similar, but Sylvina is asking, in drawing from the sensorial, did you have a framework for affect? And then Angela is also wondering how you managed your own kind of sensory embodied entangled space within your research.
Great questions. Thank you so much. I think my original sort of area of research is sort of sex work and gender studies. So my original aim in researching Soho was to think about sex work and how it's sort of been affected. And Magali comes from a different perspective. So together we were able to kind of think about these processes in new ways. And I think the affective sort of emerges naturally from the sensorial. So it's not something we went into thinking, oh, this is going to be, something that's laden with affect or it's a particularly effective project. But it emerges. And I think if you speak to people who have lived in Soho for long periods of time or people who've been pushed out or marginalized, there's an emotional resonance that comes with that disenfranchisement that we really wanted to capture. And I've completely forgotten the second part of the question.
It was about how you manage your own sensory embodied entangled space within the research.
I mean, that's a really great question, and I think very complicated. When Magali and I first decided to do a multisensorial approach, one of the first things we did, we're sort of walking and we're trying to map all of the sensory elements that are coming at us at the same time, and it was just too much. And so I think as we walk through any sort of city space or any kind of very busy urban setting, we sort of tune out or block out different things as we walk through. So what we decided to do on our walks was pay attention to one sensory element on any given walk. And it was really interesting by kind of blocking out the other senses, how much came through. And often it was quite overwhelming. So it was really interesting thinking about, like, you know, in your day-to-day life, you just kind of get on with things. Sometimes you wear headphones to block things out. But when you're really paying attention to these sensory elements, they come thick and they come fast. So I want to, I guess, particularly point out the sort of the smell mapping, which particularly when we were looking at the nighttime economy, so mapping urine and mapping vomit in terms of smells was really overwhelming, but really interesting experience, because those are things that are often quite disgusting that you kind of push to the side, but when you pay attention to them and you recognize where they are, they become really valuable sort of sources of data. So I think for us, it was trying to recognize that we couldn't do all of the senses at once, that we had to pay attention to one thing or another, otherwise it would just get lost. And so by kind of attuning ourselves to different sensorial elements, we were able to kind of break them into fragments, I guess, and then reassemble them into the sort of the collage that we talk about in our fragment methodology.
Great, thank you. And then Dawn, a question, and a few people had a question about how you analyze your data. So this is for Dawn, but if Erin or Sweta want to join in on this too.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. I analysed the data by watching the film. So it was interesting to go through a long process of sort of distilling the data. I mean, Garrett and Hawkins talk about filmmaking as a creative analytic process in itself. So it's as I was working with the data to make the film, I was beginning to recognise also what was going on in terms of the rhythms of the market space, and they were distilled and revealed in much more powerful ways than through other forms of data collection in the film. So I talked today about the kind of failure of my own body in using that solely as a tool, and it's still instructive, but just not relying it on the body as a tool to register rhythm, whereas the film does much more work for me. But I also did, as part of a broader ethnography, lots of interviews and informal chats and observations, and even one night's work at the market. And so I was bringing those different sets of data to bear on one another to be able to make the sense I did of the film itself.
Great, thank you. Erin or Sweta, would you like to add anything?
I'd be happy to talk about mapping, I think, because the mapping was really a way for us to kind of to process our data and to come up with a way of analyzing these very kind of abstract or ephemeral kinds of senses, feelings, and affects. So just by walking through the city and kind of paying attention to smells or colors, lighting, all of these things, having a map that went along with it and doing it as part of a dialogic process was really helpful. So, Magali and I would go out saying, okay, right, we're gonna map smell, and we'd pick a street or two streets, and we'd spend hours sort of mapping smells. It looked quite bizarre going into street corners. People were looking at us like, why are these two women sort of, smelling the bin? But actually, as you created a smell map as you went through, it became part of the analytic process, and being able to talk about it together and working through it, it became a form of, I guess, a sensorial ethnographic field notes, really, that we were able to then kind of to sort of think through and to put into words in some way. So actually, mapping was an essential part of our ability to analyze this data in a way that I don't think field notes in and of themselves would have been able to do.
If we have time, I'm happy to jump in. This is Sweta here. As our colleagues have just said, I think one of the things I struggled with was the primacy of the written frame as the sort of output in relation to analysis. So my the strongest tool in terms of analysis was autoethnography. So I use my own body as a research instrument by undergoing various different hair treatments, and then really writing sort of hair diaries in terms of what it felt like to have a weave, what it felt like to have, locks and braids, and so on and so forth. The other thing I did was a mixture of methods. It is really interesting how touch became important. A number of my participants actually wanted me to touch their hair. and engage with the textuality of the transformation. So there's in a sense, what was really important for me analytically was the importance of relationships between me and the participant, but also between different types of textures. My hand, their hair, the context in which all of this was happening. I'm in the process of analyzing some of the other visual and sensory data, but with ethnography, I think it's just another layer or another way of seeing something that's already there. So what has emerged, and again, similar to what Erin is saying, it's a way of visibilizing what's not there or what can't be grasped or seen. And that's what Dawn was saying as well. And at the moment, I'm looking at biographical interpretative narrative techniques from the interviews and triangulating them with the visual material and with some of their own object biographies. So they sent me, some of the participants sent me images from photo elicitation techniques, pictures of their own hair care routines at home and so forth. So there's a richness there. And the last thing I'd say is the social materiality of hair, it just lives and lives again. As you've seen from the art exhibition, there's just so many ways to engage with and expand on this data. It doesn't die off at the end of the project. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And I'm just going to do one more question because I found these questions. So two people, it's a little bit different, but sort of the same sort of theme, is Manuel and Divina. They both asked, so partly you're working with these communities, so are there ethics that you have to consider? And then also, how are you sharing what you're finding with the communities? So let's have each of you take this. So maybe start with Dawn first.
Hi there. Yeah, that's a really important question. So there are huge ethical implications of doing anything with especially visual data. So for me, I find that it's important to, well, get to know the community, the situation, the norms, as you would in any ethnography, before doing something that maybe feels or has the potential to feel more exposing. So the film emerged from a process where I'd spent about 3 months at the market 2 or 3 times a week, and it emerged as something for me that felt a possibility and methodologically and conceptually interesting, but it also felt possible to approach people locally to ask their permission. So obviously I asked permission of the market authorities, but then I spoke to the individuals, especially the ones that are closer to the camera, because they could be identified through their location, if not visibly recognized. And then I set the film up on a private YouTube channel and showed it to them and got an opportunity. They had an opportunity to ask for any changes. You know, the funny thing is, I mean, obviously there's a lot at stake here, but sometimes the things we worry about as researchers ethically are not the things our participants worry about. And they were quite chuffed to see themselves in the film, and that depends, and they could recognize themselves in a way that I couldn't through their local knowledge. And I guess it depends very much on the context of the research. And there, the site was under threat for redevelopment, and so they were glad to see their work recognised and valued. But still, it was very important to go through that process of getting consent. Thank you.
Sure. Erin?
Yeah, I mean, doing ethnography in this way, because we're looking at, 1 square mile isn't a huge space, but it's big enough. We're very conscious of ethics in terms of the photography that we take, in terms of images that we use. So particularly when we're thinking about like the sex industry, we make sure that nobody is sort of pictured in the sort of the images or the videos that we take. But I've also worked quite closely with the English Collective of Prostitutes, who have a really good connection with sex workers in the area. We've worked with Save Soho and Soho Society, so sort of charities and special interest groups who have a vested interest in sort of maintaining Soho as it is. And working with them, I think, is really important so that we understand the complexity of what's happening, and that we're not kind of distorting what we're saying, or kind of I guess talking about it in a way that's not true for them. And of course, Westminster City Council are not inclined at all to speak to us. So it is quite one-sided in a sense. And I think anytime when you're thinking about gentrification, you have to be careful about not being nostalgic. So not thinking that just because something has been there for a long time that it's necessarily good or that it should be kept, but trying to think critically about the populations that are being kind of pushed out or moved out, and how marginalized or how kind of vulnerable they are. So thinking about all of those things as part of the research process and making sure that we're paying attention to the complexity of the social dynamics was really key for us.
Great, thank you. Sweta, do you want to add anything?
Sure, thanks so much, Stacey. Fantastic questions actually from this webinar, so really appreciate the interest. In my own case, I was very aware of my social location as a person of color myself and as a researcher researching other marginalized communities. However, I was very clear that while I had some partial insider status, I was also very much an outsider, as I'm not Black Caribbean, but Indian. And so it created a partial empathy, a sense that we could talk with each other, but that I did not have the insider perspective. I had written and verbal consent with all my participants when I interviewed them, both informally and formally. One of the things that I was very, very clear on was that I would not take images inside the salon setting while they were getting their hair done, because there's a vulnerability to participants in those spaces in various stages of transformation. So that was important. There were children involved, in the background in these salons, and I was very clear not to take any recordings of visual or indeed audio work from them. In terms of feeding back to the communities, I've actually continued contact with both salons 3 years down, after the project finished. However, things have changed because of gentrification. Some of the salons have actually closed or moved. In Brixton at the moment, some of the older Afro hair salons have moved to Peckham, like basically other areas in London. So there's a lot of movement and change. Staff members have changed as well. I also want to highlight the sensitivities of openly studying racism or racialization in any distinct way. And quite often people in their everyday lives are not aware of or don't really want to problematize themselves as being complicit in racial encounters. So it's often about reflecting back, not in the way you would say in academic publishing, but in the way in which you're able to say, this is salon life as I saw it, and does that chime with your understanding of salon life as well? And just as Dawn was saying, some of my older participants were thrilled. They were delighted someone was interested in their hair. They were showing me pictures of them having a night out, So there's all of that. But I do want to say with visual work, it's about image by image consent. So you have to think about for what purpose it's being used, what it does, what it says, and what does it advance as well. And I think one of the difficulties, for instance, with the Kentish salon, is that I'm pretty certain they didn't mean to be particularly racializing. It was just upholding a commercial view that this particular beauty standard works better than others. So I had to be really careful that my own perspective did not overshadow what the ethnography was trying to achieve. Thank you.
That's great. Well, this was excellent presentations. Thank you so much for sharing your research. And like I said, we recorded this, so people get the recording next week. And just want to thank you all for your time, and thank Ali for being a partner in organizing these webinars.
And thank you, Stacey, and everyone else. And thanks for those of you who stuck around and listened to the questions. I found all of this really, really interesting and timely, and I hope you did too. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.